Maybe if you want to stay close, it's good, because we are going to try to do something that is not really a lecture. We're going to try some performative ways of talking and sharing.
Et en fait, d'abord, merci d'être là. On est très heureux de vous accueillir. Il y a un certain nombre de personnes également que nous attendons et qui vont arriver un peu au fur et à mesure de ce séminaire, de cette séance de séminaire, puisqu'il a été pensé dans un cadre particulier qui est celui également de la préparation d'une performance qui aura lieu demain entre midi et 18h, mais qui a commencé par un atelier cet après-midi qui a débuté à 13h et en fait qui se poursuit. Et donc au fur et à mesure que les personnes terminent cette préparation, elles vont pouvoir nous rejoindre. En tout cas, on est très heureux de vous accueillir, très heureux également de retrouver Alfredo Aracil, puisqu'il s'agit de la 11e et ultime séance de séminaire, mais que le séminaire a également commencé avec Alfredo Aracil, qui était venu nous parler des contestations psychiatriques en Espagne et pour nous permettre notamment d'identifier les différences avec l'Angleterre, l'Italie, la France et l'Allemagne, qui ont chacun eu des traditions différentes dans ce domaine. Donc pour rappel, Alfredo Aracil est chercheur et commissaire indépendant. Il est espagnol, mais il va s'exprimer ce soir en anglais. Cependant, n'hésitez pas à vous adresser à l'espagnol si vous le souhaitez. Il a réalisé un master de culture visuelle et d'histoire de l'art contemporain à l'Université autonome de Madrid dans un programme développé en lien avec le centre d'études du musée de la Reina Sofia. Il a d'ailleurs réalisé un programme de lecture publique au sein du musée de la Reina Sofia au sujet de l'antipsychiatrie. Il a également, de 2013 à 2016, été membre de l'équipe de Laboral, le centre d'art de Gijón, d'accord, je le prononce correctement. Et depuis 2007, il est à Buenos Aires où il réalise un master de commissaire d'exposition et en lien avec des artistes à l'Institut Torquato di Tella à Buenos Aires.
Oui.
Donc merci beaucoup d'être là ce soir et nous allons vous écouter sur performance et performativité.
Okay, thank you so much for coming, and thank you so much, Athamas, for bringing me here again. So happy to see how it's going. The program is so good. I mean, to know that you are not thinking alone, that you have allies and you have people that you can share experiences and practices. Actually, today I'm going to talk about experiences and practices. In the beginning, my work was focused on this idea of studying antipsychiatries in the Spanish context. It was so involved in history, so involved in politics. As you know, Spanish history is always related to this strange phenomenon that we have during 40 years that is called Franquismo, the dictatorship, that it was mainly the thing that organized the anti-psychiatric movement in Spain. Let's say that the young psychiatrists that were involved in this kind of rebellion and revolution were also engaged in this kind of fighting against Franco and against the dictatorship. So in the beginning, my work was about bringing to light some documents, testimonies, interviews that I have been making with psychiatrists and with people who were working in asylums for maybe 20 years during the last part of the Franco dictatorship, 60s and 70s mainly. I don't know why, I do know why. When I went to Argentina, something happened. My education was different there. I was working with artists, and I was suddenly asking myself different questions that were not about history, and were not about history of art. A series of questions that were about creation, and about how creation could be think in a therapeutic way. How can therapy think as a part of art practices? Well, I think I'm going to play a video first for breaking the ice and for making more clear what I'm trying to think with other people, as I said, because it's not a matter of being investigator. It's a matter of being an investigator working with artists and trying to develop things that could work in a therapeutic way. So I'm going to start with a video. We're going to discuss the video. As I told you, we are going to try something different today. We're going to try like a conversation between you and me. Otherwise, you will get tired of listening for 2 hours to me. So we will start with this video, and then we can discuss what it is in the images.
play to you people. And somebody told me you people are crazy, but I'm not so sure about that. You seem to be all right with me. The way I walk is just the way I walk. The way I talk is just the way I walk. The way I smile is just the way I smile. Touch me, baby, and I go. The way I love is just the way I love. Oh, every one I'm thinking of. Touch me, baby, oh, feeling so good. But now I'm not thinking I wanna, but I don't know where my good, oh no. wanna, but I don't know if I should. All right. I'm morning, I'm noon and night, all right. Hey, let's rock it, man. Rock! Come on, it's a dance right there. Way you love me, got to cramp my style. Oh, little baby, I will say bye-bye.
Later, if you want, we can see more. It's amazing. Don't know if you have this image in your mind, who they are, where this place is. I don't know if you have something clear about this performance, because indeed it is a performance. It's a music performance. But how is establishing a kind of performativity? Let's play this game. Let's say that is something that is a performance, and let's say that is something else going on that is performativity taking place. This is a video from the Cramps, American band from the late 70s and the 80s until nowadays. I think they are playing. Is recorded in an asylum, in a mental asylum in Los Angeles, California. If you don't know this information, maybe you get confused of who are crazy and who are not crazy in this video, because something strange is happening. The people from the audience is getting really close to the musicians, and something weird is happening, in my opinion. Something that is linked to the idea of performance as a way of producing effects and sense in the bodies. Obviously, it's a matter of discourse and talking. They are singing, they are bringing some lyrics to the audience, and they are producing something on their way of behaving. They are breaking the way of behaving that usually takes place in a mental asylum. Obviously, this is something that is not new, even in the 80s. If you take a look to the history of antipsychiatric movement, there was a lot of theater and a lot of ways of producing this kind of performativity in the bodies of the people who are not meant to be willing, deciding, moving, expressing. So it's something that is obviously linked to the idea of bringing together a space of new codes, of new ways of expressing, and of new gestures. Don't know if it's clear what I'm saying, meaning that obviously there's someone playing music, but there's a lot of people doing things that are linked to music. What I try to say is that performance is one thing, and performativity is another thing. If you take a look to the history of arts of the 20th century, in the 60s there was a huge movement that thought the art practices not only related to an object. That's something clear. We are in an institution that is dedicated to history of art, so we know for sure that in the 60s something was happening. But at the same time, if you take a look to the history of psychiatry in the 60s, something was happening also. Something that is related also to the materialization of bodies and to the expressing of bodies into another kind of institutional patterns. Here, it's also funny because we are thinking this kind of process without art, meaning music is art. That's clear, but it's funny that we are art historians talking about this kind of process without referring to our practices, because maybe our thoughts were confused in a way. Maybe we thought that art therapy was only about art. For me, for many other people, art therapy is not a way of making people employed or occupied in something that is producing their madness into an object. It's something that is connected to the idea of therapy as an art and art as a therapy also. Obviously, you can take a look to many collections of the 20th century where they got a lot of artworks of people who were living in mental institutions. But in relation to this kind of change in the psychiatric movements or in the psychiatric history in the 60s, something was going on in ours. So my idea is to bring these two things together and to think performance not only as a genre or as a moment in history of art in the 60s and in the 70s. My idea is to think how can some performativity can be created in a space that is closed, in an institution that is, so codified, so choreographic in the way that they produce mental sickness. I mean, by, I think it was 1962, Irving Goffman, who was a psychologist, was investigating in this kind of idea of many places like mental institutions that are producing a choreography inside the institutions to produce the bodies and the feelings and the sensibility and the sense of the people who live inside them. So this is a mental asylum, but it can be also a concert. It's interesting because you can bring this kind of practices outside the institutions. Now I'm going to play another video that is not from the 60s, it's from the 80s, but it's from an artist who was thinking this kind of processes outside the art institutions. She is Lydia Clark, you might know her, and she was working in a kind of clinic that is not medical, a kind of clinic that is not, it's not therapy in a way, but it's therapy also, because it's therapy because it's changing the performativity of the people who are living through this kind of process, through this kind of another way of living process, a process that takes place in the ordinary life. Lydia Clark was a well-known artist in the 60s, and suddenly in the 70s, when she came back to Brazil after living here in France, she decided to try something else that was not producing art, producing therapy, outside the art institution. She was not selling her work, she was not taking part in exhibitions. She was working like a clinic, but beyond clinic.
Uma pessoa que veio na minha casa e passou esses objetos e ela se sentiu como se todo o corpo dela, as células começaram a vibrar. E esse daqui, que é mais pesado, foi colocado em cima da perna e ela achou que era um bicho. E quando ela saiu da minha casa, ela pegou um táxi, ela começou a conversar com o chofer de táxi, e ela notou que ela podia ter uma comunicação integral com o mundo inteiro, com todo...
Sorry for that.
E ela notou que ela podia ter uma comunicação integral com o mundo inteiro, com todo o coletivo. Então esse aqui é muito corpo, que é muito pesado, ó, mais do que os outros. Esse é um saco de água, que eu acho muito bonito, porque ele corre no corpo dele. também tem vários significados, nunca tem um significado só. E o barulho também é muito importante, o barulho desse. Esse é muito curioso, porque esse foi um cliente que eu tive que trouxe um dia e disse: essa é a pele de meu pai, e passe a pele de meu pai, é uma bucha. Então ficou incorporado junto com os objetos, e quando ele queria, eu passava e ele dizia: é a pele do meu pai. Essa mesma pessoa me trouxe essa estopa e ela abria a sunga e colocava dentro da sunga e dizia que era para tampar a vagina que ela tinha. É um homem, né? Mas ele vivia a vagina que ele tinha. E todo o problema dele, evidente, era em relação ao pai. Esse, para mim, é dos objetos melhores que eu tenho, porque o que predomina nos objetos sempre é o lado pesado e o lado leve, ou o lado quente e o lado frio. Também pode ser colocado em qualquer lugar do corpo. Esses são as sementinhas que uma artista me deu. Então eu fiz um outro objeto em que dá uma sensação muito gostosa, porque a semente é muito fragmentada e muito ligeira. Esse aqui é um objeto muito especial, porque esse não só eu passo no corpo do sujeito, como no final, quando ele assenta e ele começa a brincar com ele tem duas opções: ou ele não arrebenta, ou ele arrebenta e nesse momento eu passo a mão na cabeça para desculpabilizar a quebra do objeto e dou a ele um outro plástico vazio, faço ele encher esse plástico aqui e repor o objeto integral, que é esse aqui. Então esse objeto é no final que eu uso ele, é muito importante.
Well, we can actually stop there. I don't know if you get anything from her talk. She was speaking in Portuguese with Spanish subtitle. As I said, this is the way.
Integral, que é esse aqui. Então esse objeto é no final que eu uso um outro plástico vazio, faço ele encher esse plástico aqui e repor o objeto integral, que é esse aqui. Então esse objeto.
Okay. So she was explaining her practice, her way of thinking therapy, of clinics in an artistic way. Why artistic? Obviously, she's an artist, so she's producing art, let's say. But somehow it's strange because it's not the typical way of presenting art. It's something more close to a tutorial, a video that is useful for the people who are needed, a kind of therapy, a kind of, don't know, maybe psychoanalysis could be close to this kind of also display. But it's funny because she was so engaged with art, she was so engaged with producing objects, she was so engaged with sculpture. At the end, when she decided not to do art, she was also working with objects. It's also funny because I start my presentation saying that I was not going to talk about objects, and I was not going to talk about art producing objects. I was not going to talk about art as a way of producing objects. But at the end, this video gives you also clear image of how objects can be useful in therapy. That's something that I take obviously from Judy Butler and the way that performative is think nowadays. During the 60s was also a book from Austin that is called How to Make Things with Words. You know this book, obviously. The main idea of this book is that language can produce reality. Language can also produce reality and can transform reality in a way. this is something that in the beginning I was explaining in relation to gestures, movements, and ways of moving and ways of behaving in an institution, but also in reality, in the quotidian. And here you can get an idea also of objects, but in another way, because it's not a way of have the object as something separate from the practice. It's something that you use for the clinics, for the therapy. What I'm saying with this is that maybe with performativity, there's another way also to look into objects and to communicate with objects. As this idea of hosting, of performativity, producing reality, can be think with objects as ways of communicating with objects, you can get another sense of performativity that is linked to the idea of communication with things that are not animated. And also to one thing that is different, that is the idea of rituals and how can objects be used in a ritual. Actually, this kind of use of things that are useful for bringing reality into another kind of dimension, into another kind of use. It's a way of using things for Lee Clark. It's a way of producing things that could be useful for the relation with the objects, but also with the relation of the people who is involved in the therapy. And I said rituals because if you take a look to the images of antipsychiatric movements and theater that was popular in the 60s, you also can get the idea of a ritual going on. Now I'm going to play a video from the 80s also, from a mental asylum in Spain, from the north of Spain, that is called Ruballón in Vigo. You will see that they are also engaged in a kind of ritual. They are using objects and they are using their bodies as a therapy. I'm going to switch off the music because it's awful. Sorry. Okay, this is mainly the kind of images that you can get from any mental asylum from the 80s, in a way. But in another way, you can find something different. It's funny that they, well, at the end, you can see like a theater, like a play going on. In my opinion, sometimes performance and performative can be think only in a theatrical way. Let's say that performance not always produce performativity, and sometimes performance is only useful in a kind of closed space that can be called theater, or performance in a way, in many ways actually, is behaving like theater. But also in the video, you can find a kind of everyday life, everyday actions, everyday situations that are also affected by another kind of performativity, and a kind of performance that is not think and is not play in a theatrical way. I was saying rituals because in the beginning of the video, it was an image of some people together in a circle. It's funny because the images are supposed to be like radical in a way, but in another sense they are so naive maybe, and so about control. Again, this is a way of establishing a difference between a kind of performance that only produces theater and a kind of performativity that takes place in the ordinary life. If you take a look to art history in the 60s, dealing with this idea of stop art objects or less not produce only art objects, it was a moment in the 60s where Fluxus and where Alan Capro start to think the performativity of the performance, but in the everyday life. Actions that take place in your daily life, actions that are about consciousness, taking consciousness of the things that you do for sure, the things that you do like a robot, the things that you do that you don't seem to be doing something. It's always this kind of difference, what I'm trying to bring. If you think performance as theater, you only get this kind of closed environment where everything is planned, and maybe you can get also an idea of systems that is interesting, but in a way is also closed. If we think this difference in mental institutions, it was a moment in the 70s in Italy, in Trieste, where Franco Basaglia was playing something different with performance and also with theater. But let's say that the interest was in the performance. Here you got another video that I think is available in the exhibitions downstairs. This is from the mid-70s, and it's from Trieste, and it's action that was displayed with a sculpture with Marco Cavallo. I think you know Marco Cavallo. Marco Cavallo is a sculpture that the people who were living in Trieste were carrying from one place to another. Actually, it was carried out of the mental institution. It was carried through all Italy or something like that. I think it was traveling from different asylums, from Trieste to different places. I don't know what is going on. Ah, I see. Here. does anyone know if we got internet working? Because it seems that it's not really working now. To type. Yeah, well, I'm going to try to describe Marco Cavallo action. It's not really. Oui. 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 If you want, we can go downstairs later and we can take a look to the video. For me, what is interesting about Marco Cavallo is the idea of breaking through the doors of Trieste, of trespassing the limits of the institution, of taking this sculpture that is a horse, actually, Marco Cavallo, I think it's blue horse, yeah? It's a blue horse, huge blue horse, that this was carried, and it was carried by the people who were living in the institution. And it was a way of connecting people who was living inside the institution with people who was living not in the institution. Obviously, the people who were working there, like psychiatrists and this kind of professionals who were working there, were involved. But in a way, this horse transformed the way that they behave with the patients, with the users of the mental asylum. It was a way of establishing a new kind of performativity with an object again. So it's not like Lydia Clark with the relational object, but it's also something similar in a way because it's like an interactive object who established a new kind of roles, a new kind of game, a new kind of even training, because it's a matter also of training. It's a matter of developing something together and in another way breaking this kind of roles and systems that are applying always in institutions. So it's a kind of disruptive moment where, never mind. So I was trying to think this kind of ambivalence between producing art objects and not producing art objects, also with this idea of performance and performativity. Let's say that it's strange how these objects are supposed to have another kind of use in therapy. Now what I'm trying to reach is to the idea of, again, therapy as art and art as therapy. Why? Because sometimes you get really, really angry with the kind of work that is made by the label of art therapy, meaning that art therapy sometimes can be really, really close to producing and working. Working, meaning going to a factory and producing objects for, something that you don't care, actually. Something that is not about your life. Something that is not useful in your therapy process. But in another way, producing objects together and using objects and trying to communicate with objects that doesn't share your language could be really, really useful in a way that establish another kind of behavioring, another kind of being together also. This nowadays obviously is not like in the 80s. I wouldn't say that art therapy is close only to the idea of producing objects and producing objects that take sense, that make sense in an asylum, but it's not difficult to think the limits of this kind of practices. I mean, it's not difficult to think that if you go to a place where art therapy is taking place, you will see people somehow working, somehow doing things with their hands that could be understood as a way of developing techniques, as a way of only being aware of how to use your hands in one sense. I'm obviously not against doing things with hands. I'm obviously not against producing objects, but I like to think that there's another way of dealing with this kind of producing. For example, now I'm trying to develop a way. I'm trying to develop with other people. I'm trying to develop with people who is involved in art practices ways of using art, let's say. I don't really like the word using art, but I think it's useful in a way. Let's say using art as a way of, changing this kind of consciousness that you have of your own life. Bringing another kind of affective space where you can get in touch with the people who is sharing the therapy with you, and also with the people who is like a professional giving therapy. For sure, it's good to have this kind of communication with professionals, but it's not really easy sometimes because they stay close to the ways of doing things that they have edited. I mean, to the ways that they know to do, and the ways that they constantly go and share spaces with people who live in the mental asylums or just go through. In a way, it's also important to have this kind of connection between, because otherwise, let's say that you're not really sure of this process. Let's say that you're not really sure of how can be this therapy useful in a therapeutical way. I'm going to play another video, if I can, that I got here. Thank you so much. Okay.
Habitación acolchonada, servicio urgente para extraños. Camisa dura para gente especial, mal lavada, muy bien marcada. El furgón tranquilamente blanco. Gente, hay mucha gente. Gente tranquila y blanca. Nada negro. El servicio es severo. Gente especial, una ducha hermética de agua fría, fría, muy fría. te voy a sacar de aquí. Te voy a sacar de aquí.
Esta tarde se inicia en Perlora un seminario sobre la transformación de los servicios psiquiátricos en España. Este encuentro...
Well, this is documentation from the late 70s in Spain, the north of Spain. It's about the closing of a mental asylum that was really important. Why I bring this video is for underlining this idea of institutions producing performativity, creating a performance daily in the way of living, of these people who live inside the institution, but also because I think it's really interesting to think in the communal way of living that mental asylums were think from the 20th century to nowadays. Obviously it's not the same because it's not the same situation, but what I'm trying to think is what if we rethink the idea of community and communal spaces, not in a control and disciplinary way, like in the mental asylums, but a way of, having another kind of care, another kind of attention between ourselves, another kind of being together that was loose in the way. In the process of closing these kind of spaces. For me, what is important of the video also is, apart from this kind of gestures that you can see in the video, in the bodies of these people who are living inside, is this idea of choreography, of something that is going on in some mental asylums that is like, taking place. The way like unconsciousness is working also, taking place in an unconscious way, taking place every day, as I said. Taking this perspective of what is communal and what is communal space, what is challenging nowadays is to think how come art therapy can be think together as a way of producing community, as a way of creating this kind of spaces or for taking care and for being listened, for being being with the others, not in the way as everyday life takes place. In that sense, I've been trying to think and to practice a kind of work that is about creating the communal, but not in a theatrical way, not by making theater with therapy or therapy with theater, but with this kind of mixture between performance and performativity, a kind of performance that allows the body to express and to find his own way of being. Today we have been trying something in here. We have been trying to create or to produce a performance from an atelier. But you can see that obviously it's important to create this kind of performance, this kind of space where the bodies are going to be seen, are going to be acting in a way, but mainly the goal is to produce this kind of experience, but not in a theatrical way. Trying to create this kind of experience, but from the people who is engaged to the practice. try to create another kind of behaving, another kind of perception, and another kind of body with art therapies and with objects that can be used in a performance, but always in a performative way. Actually, now that we are more people than from the beginning, I was going to suggest that maybe we can try this kind of performativity. I was going to invite you to find your own place in this room. You're all sitting in the place that you seen in the beginning when you get inside, and I will like you to, I will invite you, I would like you to change your place and to find which place is your place here. So this is a kind of practice that we can play together for trying to create another way of sharing, another way of being here. So, well, if you want, you can do that. That's an option that I suggest that you can do. It's clear that that's the point. That's the point. That's the point. To find your own place is to find a place that you know for sure that you are happy to be there. So let's start if you want. Yeah. Maybe your own place is where you are now. I don't know. I'm guessing. Please. So this is a kind of practice that actually is taken from a book. Well, you will see which one, but don't know. It could be silly in a way, but in another way, could be useful for being in the space with the others in different ways. Well, that's somehow the thing that I'm trying to develop with my practice, like behaving like a curator in a therapy or in a clinic space that is not my space, but it's about also the things that I can introduce in the space. Today in the atelier that we were having, it was also an invitation for becoming something else, an invitation for changing maybe place or just changing the way that you look at things. So performativity, as I said, is this thing that is connected to the way of producing new effects and new senses in the way that the space is occupied. So I was also going to play one last video. I don't know if it's possible. Because it's about traces. It's about also placing oneself in relation to the others. It's from Deligny. You all know Deligny, and it's from Séminaire. It's a film from the 70s where a lot of performative things are taking place. One hand, you have this relation with objects that is weird, that is bizarre, and in the other hand, you have this relation with space and how space is populated, not populated really, how it's traced, how it's put into a kind of movements that take place at the same time. Apparently it's not working. That's performativity also. Well, Segaman is the name of the film. It was produced in the 70s, mid-70s, 1975, I think. You can see in the film Deligny working with a bunch of autists, boys who were living in the forest, but it's not really the forest, it's Séance. Don't know where is Séance? Séance, wait. Seven, wait. They were living there for years. They were living in a poor way. They were living in a place that were not a mental hospital. It was not an asylum. They were living in the nature that was important to the kind of practice that Deligny was trying to perform, because it's also a performance. Everything that happened there was a performance, but a performance that was important to the daily life of the people who were living in this kind of space. A performance that it was not taking place in a kind of systematic way. It was open to new things that was happening all the time, like sounds, like the animals who were part of the living of these people. I don't know if... I was also going to play the video because I was so interested in the way that objects are used in the video. For instance, there's a moment in the film where a guy was like, don't know, 7, 8 years old, is playing music, but he's not really playing music, he's playing with things. Playing with things and creating and transforming reality with these things that he is handling in his hand. Actually, he's handling wood, and he's producing sound with the wood. You can see that he's communicating actually with the wood. You can see, like in the video of Lydia Clark, that he is somehow connected to another kind of communication that is not language at all. That is another kind of language. This is a place where Deligny and the boys and the people who were with Deligny work and live. Actually, I don't know where is Séance. I don't know where is in France Séance, but well, the place is like apart from reality, maybe. Maybe it's also a way of keeping on with the dreams of the counterculture of the 60s, trespassing into the 70s, an idea of living together as revolutionary people who were engaged with their practice, really, really engaged.
Première. Parler. Parler comme si c'était tout naturel. On parlait de ce gamin-là et des autres qui lui ressemblent, alors que nous avons tout fait pour nous en passer du langage, de ce fameux langage qui nous fait ce que nous sommes. Et maintenant, il faut lui rendre des comptes. Boutique, ce gamin-là, alors, à quoi se fier? À quoi se fier lorsqu'il fait défaut? Le langage. nous nous sommes mis à tracer. Ce gamin-là, qui n'est pas parlant, trace. Pendant des mois, sa main a tracé des ronds.
But by seeing the images, it's clear, it's pretty clear, but we can discuss it, but for me it's pretty clear that it's not only using the objects, it's not only taking the objects in your use, it's not only being in control of the use of that kind of object. It's also about, and it's mainly about, transforming reality with objects, obviously, but also to trying to get or to reach a language that is not human, a language that can produce effects in your body, maybe therapeutic, but that are important to describing the kind of relation that you got with your ambient, with your environment. It's a kind of use of performativity in a sense where the non-human objects are also engaged in reality with us, are also engaged in communication with us. This is an example from the 70s, but nowadays with autism, this thing of communicating with objects, it's about communicating with things that are not animated, are also really taking place, are really actual in a way. This is, I promise, the last video that I'm going to play. Another one.
This is from a handout I gave while speaking in a training for staff who work for people with developmental disabilities. It is about what it means to be dehumanized, and it applies to a far broader group of people than the original audience. It is to make this clear about something that is done to us by other people, not something intrinsic to who we are. Being an unperson means that people talk in front of you as if you aren't there. If they know you understand them, it means you're not enough of a person for it to matter. It means listening to staff gossip, saying things they would not dare say in front of real people. It means hearing their bluntest viewpoints about you out loud to your face, with the person behind that face unacknowledged. It means hearing confidential information about other unpersons. Being an unperson means that your life is not a real life. It means being treated worse than most people would treat their own pet gerbil, and with less guilt. It means that your existence seems to fill people with disgust and fear. People see and describe you as a hollow shell, a body without a soul, a shambling child, or a vegetable. Or else they romanticize your life, calling you a special angel on earth. Whatever they call you, people refuse to see that you exist at all. Being an unperson means being considered non-communicative. If you somehow, once in a blue moon, manage to communicate in speech, those words will be seen in pathological terms rather than communicative ones. If you communicate in writing, people will question your authorship. If you communicate with behavior, you will be punished, restrained, drugged, or put on a behavior program. No matter how clever and intricate a communication system you devise, you will be described as incapable of true communication. Being an unperson means having all the true communication drowned out of you. It means having your behavior and words, if you have them, molded to fit what other people want or expect of you. It means having this molding placed on you like a straitjacket. It means screaming and screaming inside your head that you are a real person, but nothing gets out. On the rare occasion that something does get out, an action that is from your desires rather than your training, an oral or written statement that you really are a real person and feel trapped, you will be punished, ridiculed, or ignored. Being an unperson means being treated like a child, which should really make people think about how they view children, or at best like a beloved pet. It means that if you do something real, important, and meaningful to you, people will think it's cute. They have a special laugh reserved for that. It means being spoken to in a voice people normally use on children. Being an unperson means being brutalized. An unperson can't tell about beatings, rape, torture, and murder. If she does, she will not be believed. An unperson knows that the law will never come to his aid, not the way it does for real people. If he dies, here, today, at the hands of another, it will not be considered murder. Being an unperson means being expendable and interchangeable with all the other unpersons of the world. An unperson means living up to low expectations. It means being punished or shamed for showing emotion, awareness of your environment, or originality of thought. It means that once you no longer show these things outwardly, except maybe to a few other unpersons who know what you're doing, people take one look at your most superficial appearance and declare you even more of an unperson. Being an unperson means being hated. Not always in an overt emotional way. It means people want you to be a real person, which sounds good until you realize they don't believe you are a person already. They want to shape you into someone else, or else use you like a blank projector screen for their fantasies. Sometimes they tell you they want to reel you back, as if you're not there. Being an unperson means that your existence as who you are is denied at the deepest level by those around you. And that, being erased, is the true nature of hate. Rage is nothing in comparison to erasure. Being an unperson means that if you must hurl your abilities, everything you have learned over the years, and attempt to advocate for yourself in any possible way you know how, you will be labeled manipulative, attention-seeking, or a bad or difficult client. You learn that people like to work with the good clients. The ones who have been so twisted by being treated as unpersons that they are completely passive and compliant. You realize from memory of being like that no person on the planet should ever be twisted that far. But when you tried to stand up for yourself...
Well, can find it on the internet. I was thinking in a way of describing what is going on in the screen. But politically, you can see anger taking place. Anger, obviously a critic way of feeling a non-person in a world of persons. And that's funny because persons are the key to understand the political creation of our systems of living. That's one thing for sure, that anger is one thing important to understand the way that this kind of experience is daily held. But in another way, it's interesting what is going on with things in the video. For me, it's more interesting, actually, what is going on, not with the words, with the things that she's using to communicate, with the things that she's trying to establish a kind of relation that is communication, but is also a way of being with something else that is not the experience of daily life that we have. It's a kind of use of objects that is not our use of objects, but in a way that can be think as an artistic way of approaching to things and to reality also. That's one thing that for sure we can discuss, because so polemic, the way also that a person can call himself an unperson. What is an unperson? Does an unperson have the same capacities that we do have? Is the kind of connection that we have with the world and with the words that are inside our world? Well, that's the questions that I'm trying to answer with friends who are developing with me this kind of idea of thinking art and therapy not into a medical institution or display, but as a way of practicing freedom and practicing ways of expressing and behaving different than the conscious way of behaving is always telling you. So, well, that it was. I don't know if you have questions about this kind of things that well, yep.
No institution, then remains the body. I mean, the body is taking more importance.
Yeah.
And that's something that I was thinking of when I saw the images that you were proposing. What is the place of the body, in fact? And can there be a place inside the institution? So meaning the institution, does it need to be reformed to also let the body live, or does the institution need to be destroyed in a way to let the body live, or how can the body can interact with the institution in a way?
That's something really clever, because institutions are about letting you live or letting you get into death. So performance is also taking place in institutions, as some of the image that I brought explains, even in places like mental asylum, performances are taking place. But for answering your question is about materiality, and it's about how to construct your body, and it's about how to feel your body beyond biological perspectives. So, don't know, I'm not really happy with this idea of body as an institution, but in a way, I do understand that it's something linked to the idea of constructing, of fabrication, or something that you develop, something that is constantly produced by institutions, but something else that are not institutions, that can be not established, that can be not closed.
You used the word choreography in relation to Erving Goffman. I was wondering what writings from Goffman you were referring to in relation to this concept, if there was one in particular, and if Goffman himself uses this word, this specific word.
It's something that I was, when I started to work with anti-psychiatrist movement, I was so aware of Hoffman because someone in an interview told me that for the Spanish anti-psychiatric movement it was so important, more important than even Basaglia, or it was something that they were reading by that moment, and it was something that they were practicing. So close to the idea of working inside an institution. So I read this book that you know for sure.
Do you mean Asylum?
Asylum, yeah.
Asylum.
Yeah, but then I discovered that something else was even more interesting of Hoffman. That is called the presentation of the self in the everyday life. That's where I take choreography from. That's where I take choreography, where Goffman explains that choreography is something that is close, like a system. Like in the theater, there's a play and there's someone who is directing the bodies. In the everyday life is taking place something similar that is unconsciousness but is conscious also. Yeah, that's the concrete book. And actually nowadays I'm trying to get more deep into that kind of perspective, because it's so close to the idea of performance that Alan Caprow was holding by that period. 66, 65 or something like that. It's funny that you can see Goffman thinking in these asylums as choreography makers, and Caprow at the same time was talking about reality as a way of choreography.
But in the representation of self in the everyday life, he doesn't refer to any psychiatric
No,
hospital
not at all. Not at all. No, not at all. He's talking about everyday life. He's talking about practices that are not seen as institutions, that are not seen as systems, but they are indeed systems. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
In fact, I know that the experience that Montserrat Rodriguez also, who was here yesterday in our program, was important for you. She set up a mental institution, in fact, into an art institution. Can you tell us more about that experience and what it meant for you?
In the last book of Sueli Rolnik, there's a text in introduction by Paul B. Preciado. And at some moment he said, whatever, that it's about taking the psychoanalysis into the jungle, bringing the jungle into the asylum. It's like crossing these kind of two worlds. That makes me think in how Montserrat started this project, the clinica that she established in Magba Museum. It was a 10-year experience of bringing people from institutions inside the museum, but not for working from the museum. It was not about talking about the collection. It was not about talking about the art. It was playing clinics inside the museum. And it's funny also because today that we were in a group therapy in the room where the atelier was taking place, someone asked for the reason that was keeping us together, working as a group therapy. Sometimes it's a matter of bringing things out of his own system and his own knowledge and his own expertise. What was good and great about Monse's experience was to create this kind of confidence space, a space for taking care, in a place that is not seen as a dangerous place, a place where the medical dispositives can hurt you, can put you in a really, really fragile situation. The problem with the practice that Montserrat tried to keep years and years was the museum. And the museum at the end was not prepared for that kind of experience. That makes me think that maybe it's not the museum the place to do that. Okay, if you can do it, in an opportunistic way, let's do it, because it's something that you can take advantage of. There's a budget, there's people who are taking place of you to get it and to get out. But I don't know, sometimes I have the feeling that we are thinking about therapy and thinking about art and therapy. I get the feeling that we are so close to the art that we are supposed to care, to the things that we know for sure that are artistic. Something that maybe comes from our education, that we all come from our history, but I don't know, I have the intuition of opening this kind of perspective into something different. I was beginning my talk today with a video from the Cramps playing in a mental asylum. Maybe it's a matter of taking a look to that kind of things that happen beyond art, apart art.
I've got another question, but I don't want to be the only one to ask a question.
Sí. De la práctica, bueno, sí. Actually, it was really political because she was starting this experience when the Catalonian government was closing spaces, public spaces for care. Hospitales de día, centros de atención. The Catalonian government, who was turning into right, was trying to get rid of that kind of services. And she was working with people who knew that situation was going on. So she asked for a space in the museum for making a clinic without any kind of obligation, without any kind of obligation for making art or displaying or showing whatever they do. It was also a closed space. You cannot get into unless you are someone who are taking part of the experience. The people who were going to the experience were also going with someone from the centros de día. So it was a part of their therapy, but inside the museum, where a lot of things can be said, where a lot of things can be done that are not the things that medical staff want you to do. She's a psychoanalyst. See, she comes from that world, but somehow she is more connected to art practices than to psychoanalysis. Actually, she was close to Dora Garcia because of that kind of connections between psychoanalysis, art practices. ¿Sí? They were working with several artworks and artists who were inside this universe of mental asylums, psychoanalysis, but it was not even an obligation. It was something that the people who were there working decided to. Finally, they make a book, a huge book of this experience, of this 10-year experience, but it was the only thing that was produced for the museum. The other things that were done there, it was only about clinics. I don't know what she... That's why I think that maybe museums are not the place to do that kind of thing. That's something that for me is problematic in a way, because at the end you get the same institutional control in a way. Obviously it's not the same control that you get in a mental asylum. In a museum you can feel more free to do things that you are not supposed to do, but at the end you are reproducing the ways of institutional behavior inside the museum. And a museum and mental asylums are not really so different in many ways. Even in the architectural displays that they have, it's something about being seen and seeing things always. Yeah. But that's interesting because it was in a museum that is meant to be a place for being seen and seeing things, but the clinic experience was closed to the public. So that's something different that maybe is interesting for working. Don't know how long does it take to get rid of the museum or to get tired with the museum, but in the beginning maybe it's interesting to work with. Yeah.
And you mentioned several artists, Livia Clark, the Cramps, Dora Garcia now. Can you think of other artists that are actually exploring this porosity between the mental health institutions and the art institutions?
Yeah, many, plenty of them. Nowadays, there are a bunch of people who are engaged in social practices also, because maybe it's social practices is not only mental health. It's about discapacity, it's about outings that is something weird that is not really a mental disease. And nowadays mental disease is almost everywhere. I mean, I do work with a perspective that includes many symptoms that are not really an illness, that are connected to the way of living and also to the way of producing. Artists in this way can be, for me it's like working with allies that, don't know, obviously it's about thinking disease, about thinking how disease is produced, but the artists that I care about are the ones who try to get rid of this idea of working with mental asylums and mental health. It's like, no, it's working. It's like not taking care of diagnosis, not taking care of sickness. It's like, don't know, if you work with people who come from a mental institution, it's like working with artists at the same time. And for me, it's also artists who are interesting in my point of view, are artists who are working in really horizontal places, not assembleas, but something close to that.
What do you mean by very horizontal places?
Places where you can do things together. Yeah, together, where you can add the experiences of other people, the knowledge of other people, and you can transform power relations into something else. Yeah. Nowadays, many people actually, I do think that it's about rethinking the practices that were meant to produce freedom in this kind of horizontal spaces. Freedom is a word that is so problematic for sure, but it's maybe something that can be think in a smaller way. That what kind of practice makes you feel free in a context, in a closed context. For instance, tomorrow I would like you to be in the performance that is going to take place here, that is about this way of working with people and with the sensibility that is not yours, the sensibility that is not the inherent sensibility, the sensibility that you can build upon the others, with the others. Yeah, actually it's interesting to talk about the atelier that Florencia Rodriguez-Giles is playing. Yeah, because it's a play, it's a game, it's something like a game. And that's also interesting because it's playing, it's becoming something different by playing. That is one thing that the children does. They take it for granted, but when you became an adult, it's something that makes you feel uncomfortable sometimes. So it's becoming like transforming yourself, like feeling uncomfortable to be comfortable with yourself. The atelier is based on an idea of therapy, and art therapy, that is about transforming yourself into something else that is no oneself. That is not personal, that is impersonal, that is an unperson also, as the video was saying. It's about also a role game that we play together. We choose different pharmacos that are animals, are connected to the disease of yourself. With this disease, you can, you can work on the things that make you feel uncomfortable, make you feel guilty, make you feel anxious, make you feel angst, many things. The atelier is, well, a group of people who are sharing their diseases and their, sickness is not really the word. It's like sharing what they feel like something that is not making themselves living in a good way. It's 10 people who are socializing their disease, their problems, in order to get another way of treating, another way of being aware of what they care about. Yeah. The atelier is ending in an experience that will take place tomorrow from 5 to 6. It will be several people doing tasks, doing actions, involved in situations, with another body, with another kind of abilities that they will acquire during the atelier. Tomorrow. Thank you so much for the invitation and for the work that you're doing.